Hi everybody, my name is Alexis Silviano. I am in Group 1 and I will be presenting Lab Report 6. In this lab, we basically learned how capacitors charge and discharge in a RC circuit, basically how they store and release energy over time. And we actually see things like this every day. For an example, in our phones, capacitors are used to store small bursts of energy. Like when we use the flash for a picture, the flash works because a capacitor charges up, then it quickly releases the stored energy as light. In our experiment, we recreated that idea with a simple setup using a resistor and a capacitor. When the capacitor charges, it's like filling up a little energy tank. Electrons build on one plate, and the voltage across the capacitor starts to rise. At first, the current flows quickly, but as the capacitor fills, it's gonna get harder for more charge to move in, and the current slows down. Once the voltage crosses the capacitor, it matches the power source, and it's fully charged at that point. When it discharges, the capacitor releases that stored energy and back into the circuit, and the voltage starts high and drops down gradually, following that smooth exponential curve we will see in our graphs. The speed at which this happens mostly depends on resistance and capacitance, which together form the time constant, represented by the equation T equals R times C. A larger capacitance or resistance will make the capacitor take longer to charge and discharge. So overall, the goal of this lab was to build and test a RC circuit, observe the charging and the discharging processes, measure the time constants, and compare our experimental values with the theoretical ones to see the percent error and to see how close they matched. The materials we used for this experiment was a 33 ohm resistor, one or two capacitors, positive and negative wires, a Pascal voltage and current sensor, a passport interference, a RCT tablet, the capstone program on the computer, and a calculator for the calculations. These materials helped us measure voltage changes and visualize how the capacitor will behave over time. As for our procedure, we started by connecting the voltage LEDs to the Pascal interference, making sure that the positive and negative wires were correctly attached and powered on. This step ensured that our setup had a stable and consistent power source to deliver the correct voltage during the experiment, and making sure the wires were firmly connected was also important to avoid interference or inaccurate readings later on. For step 2, both the positive and negative wires were plugged accordingly into the RC based on the reference image, in which both resistor 33 ohms was measured throughout the experiment. This completed the main connection of our RC circuit. Using the 33 ohms resistor allowed us to maintain a fixed resistance while we observed how the capacitor behaved during charging and discharging. We made sure to follow the reference diagram carefully to avoid any reverse polarity or incorrect wiring. As for step 3, the capstone program was launched onto the computer, and a graph was created in which the y-axis was the voltage, V, and the x-axis was the time, S. This setup helped us visualize how the voltage was going to change over time as the capacitor charged and discharged. And by plotting the voltage against time, we could clearly see the exponential curve that represents the charging and discharging process. Next, for step 4, the values in the signal generator was manually adjusted with the max voltage set to 10V. The waveform was set to positive square wave frequency was 1 Hz and the amplitude was 5V and the current limit was 1.1 amp. These settings created a clear and consistent voltage signal for a current. The positive square wave was useful because it allowed us to see repeated cycles of charging and discharging the capacitor. Step 5, the recording conditions were also manually adjusted, in which the stop condition was set to stop at 3 seconds and the voltage current sensor was also rated to 1 Hz. By setting and recording the time frequency, we were able to limit the data collection to a clear short frame that only focused on 1 or 2 complete charge and discharge cycles. For step 6, to fill in table 1, resistor 33 ohms and capacitor 100 microfarads were used, and the experimental was ran and graph was created to analyze T1 and T2. At this point, we recorded the voltage change and identified the moments where the capacitor started charging. And at 63 percent, with the help of our TA, we were able to find the other values. For step 7, to fill in table 2, resistor 33 ohms and both capacitors were used, 130 and 300 microfarads. The experiment was ran and the graph was created and analyzed to find T1 and T2. After that, for the final part of the experiment, we use values T1 through T2 and the experimental capacitance from table 1 to find the experimental resistance and percent error. This final calculation helped us check the accuracy of our experiment by comparing the experimental resistance to the theoretical value. Any differences between the two allowed us to check where the experimental errors might have occurred and how consistent our results were. By following these steps carefully, we were able to collect our data, generate graphs, and better understand the relationship between resistance, capacitance, and the time constant in an RC circuit. For the third, videos demonstrating how we set up table 1 and for table 2 and how where the wires were placed into the RC circuit tablet. For data analysis, for table 1, we could see that T1 we got zero point 0.5 seconds. For T2 it was 0.504 seconds. And T overall was 0.004 s. In the experimental capacitance, we got the value 1.21 times 10 to the negative 4 farads. And for theoretical, we got 1 times 10 to the negative 4 farads. And our percent error gave us 21%. From the graph, we could clearly see the capacitor charging, and the voltage rose quickly at first, but then leveled out as it got closer to the maximum value. For table 2, which were our two capacitors in parallel, for T1 we got about close to 0.5 seconds, and which was 0.499 seconds. For T2 it was 0.518 seconds, and overall T was 0.019 seconds. For experimental capacitance, it was 5.76 times 10 to the negative 4 farads. Theoretical read 4.3 times 10 to the negative 4 farads and giving us a higher percent error of 33%. And this time we could see the curve took longer to reach 63%, the final voltage, which we concluded makes sense. When the capacitors are connected in parallel, their total capacitance seems to increase, so the time constant gets larger. That means that the capacitor stores more charge and takes more time to fully charge and discharge. And even though our graphs followed the expected exponential pattern, there were some small differences between our experimental and theoretical results, which we analyzed next. And here's our math that gave us the values for table 1 and table 2. Conclusion. As a team, we concluded that what was causing the percent error was mostly experimental limitations as the internal resistance of the wire, or maybe sensor inaccuracies, and for sure human error when reading the graph to determine T1 to T2, or even the small timings differences during the charging and discharging. We also concluded that we could modify the setup to have better results by lowering tolerance resistors and verifying that all the connections are secure, also taking multiple measurements to average out timing errors, as well ensure the signal generator produces a clean square wave and reduces voltage noise. We noticed that the time constants were not similar, and it depends both on the resistance and capacitance. Circuits with larger capacitance, such as the two capacitors in parallel, had a higher time constant because the total charge storage capacity increased. As for the percent errors being similar, we concluded that they were not identical. Each configuration produced slightly different percent errors, and maybe due to different circuit setups, and introduced different sources of uncertainty. Variations in capacitance, combination, and measurement precision affect the results. For question 5, the percent error similar to the one with the capacitance were not exactly similar. The setups with multiple capacitors introduced more resistance with wire effects and maybe increasing the overall error. The main error sources included inaccurate time measurements or non-ideal capacitor behaviors and slight voltage fluctuations. In this experiment, in general, in this experiment, we explored the charging and discharging behavior capacitors in RC circuits. We calculated their time constants and determined the percent errors in our measurements. And our findings revealed that the circuits with larger capacitance values will exhibit higher time constants, while the signal capacitor setups had smaller ones. The percent errors varied across different setups, maybe due to measurement inaccuracies and internal resistance and non-ideal component behavior. To enhance accuracy, we should ensure tighter connections, use precise resistors, and conduct more trials to average our results. Overall, this experiment demonstrated the direct correlation between resistance, capacitance, and time constant, and also emphasized the impact of minor experimental errors on the accuracy of theoretical prediction. For our credits, you can see each of our team members contributed to this lab report. Thank you.